honored today to have as my guest Terry Matlen. Thank you so much for joining me, Terry.
Thank you for having me. You're doing a terrific job, and I'm so excited to be part of it.
Oh my goodness, thank you. I was so excited when you reached out. I mean, this is really you've been on the top of my bucket list. So, I'm curious, how did you hear about the podcast?
You know, I have ADHD, Katie. So I can't remember where I started hearing your podcast. I recognized your name from, your work in the past, but I wasn't familiar with the podcast. So I heard somebody, it might have been Sarah Solden's episode. And then I jumped
Yeah.
on your website and thought, wow, you got some great guests, and I'd love to be a part of that.
I wondered if she had mentioned it because I had a conversation with her recently, and it was shortly after that conversation that you reached out, and I know you guys are good friends, so I was just curious. Anyway, so what I would love to hear from you first, I'm sure you've shared this story many times, but if you'll indulge me for the sake of my own listeners, I would love to hear kind of about your own ADHD diagnosis in terms of how old you were, when it happened, and what were the things that were happening in your life that made it click for you that you thought, okay, I should really look into this.
Well, like many women with ADHD, I was a late diagnosed woman with ADHD. I was always kind of scattered, disorganized. I procrastinated, but I had no idea what that was about. And in my day, um, it was unheard of. It was unknown that adults could have ADHD. But the story is my daughter, I have two daughters who are now young adults. My youngest had a very significant illness. She had an encephalopathy, which means a brain issue, a brain infection after a vaccine reaction. And she was extremely ill, and we didn't know if she would survive. So that was, no, that was really frightening. But she did come through, but she didn't come through it with 100% of her abilities. They didn't all return. So one of the things that was very problematic was severe ADHD, severe. And it was to the point where I had to have another adult in the house with me. She was a toddler. I had to have another adult. Once she relearned how to walk and all those things, she didn't walk, she ran. She climbed, she got into things. Severe ADHD. And in my training, I'm a clinical social worker. In my training many years ago, nobody talked about ADHD, even in children. So this was something brand new for me to try and figure out. How do I help my daughter? How do I, prevent her from doing all these things that were extremely dangerous? So I started reading. Now, back in the day, this was in the late 1980s. I think it was it was the late 80s when she got sick. There was very little out there on books to read, articles, and we really didn't have the internet going yet. But it's so odd. I found one book on adults with ADHD. It was a clinical book by, I think, Dr. Lynn Weiss. And I started reading that. I don't know why. I had no sense at the time that I might be having, some problems with this. But I was looking for help for her. So I read this book, and then I had this aha moment, like, oh my gosh, this sounds like people I know in my family. Not my kids so much, of course, yeah, but these are adults. And then I had this huge aha moment. But anyhow, I did find a book on how to help kids with ADHD. It didn't help me too much because the severity of her ADHD. But I was very curious about the adult thing. And there was just so little, there was so little. But there was so much in that book that piqued my interest that I reached out to a psychologist who happened to be local to me, one of the few clinicians who understood and treated and evaluated adults with ADHD. So by that time, I was in my early 40s. I think I was 41, maybe 42, and went to him. And sure enough, I got the diagnosis. So that's been years ago, years ago. So I know what your next question is going to
Um,
be. How did I manage? How did I deal with that piece of information? Right? No. Oh, you're the boss. You're the boss. You go.
well, I'm curious. I mean, I feel like a universal experience for those of us who were diagnosed well into adulthood is that feeling like your whole life flashes before your eyes, right? That feeling like I can't believe how many random struggles I had. all fall under this one little umbrella or big umbrella of ADHD. And it felt like for me, it was just this roller coaster of excitement that I had this answer, and then the grief that how did nobody know about this? Like it really felt like the signs were there all along, especially going back and looking at my report cards, just seeing the signs of it everywhere and really feeling like the life I could have lived, right? Really feeling a lot of sadness and grief around the diagnosis. So I'm curious, not only what was your reaction, but also looking back over the course of your life, what were some of those things that really stood out to you where you were like, oh yeah, the signs were there all along.
The signs were there, but I also, as a child, had significant anxiety issues. I had school phobia. I didn't want to go to school. And I don't know how much of that would be related to the undiagnosed, untreated ADHD. But what's different about my story, although I understand that most women, especially late diagnosed, do go through this phase. And I wouldn't say it's a phase because it can come back and forth. Even if you've been in therapy for your ADHD and you go through the grieving process and understanding this is the life I could have had, and now here I am, 30, 40, 50 and up. I didn't go through a grieving process. However, I did go through a long period of time where I was in denial because I couldn't, first of all, it still was so misunderstood back then. I didn't know anybody who had ADHD. I had never heard of it in adults. So I was going through this denial. No, it's not that. It's not that. It's because I had anxiety. I still have, some anxiety issues. Or because I missed a lot of school as a kid, because I was so frightened to go. Oh, it's because of that. I just didn't catch on because I missed so much schooling. So I went to at least, if I could remember, at least two other clinicians to get their opinion. Do I really have ADHD? So that was my big thing, was denial. Once it was confirmed by two other clinicians, I took it and ran. I didn't go through the grieving. I didn't go through what I missed out. I understood what my current problems were, what my past problems were. But as a clinician, I decided now that my life has changed for me, it was in a good way. Now I know why I can't cook dinner. Now I know why my house is cluttered. Now I know why I procrastinate with paperwork and all that sort of thing. I felt that as a clinician now I could step up and change my whole perspective of what I wanted to do as a clinician and help men and women. It started off with men and women with ADHD. So in a way, it empowered me. That's more of a unusual, I believe, from what I've experienced working with women, especially with ADHD. Mine was, and maybe it's because I have the clinical background and wanted to use my skills in helping other women. That's been my focus. Isn't that a great word for me to use? That has been my focus for the last 25 years, because once I understood what it was, my life took off. I still have struggles. I did back then. I still do now, but I have a different lens. And now I can help other women who are going through grief, who are going through anger, who are going, well, why didn't my parents take me to a therapist? Why didn't they understand me? Why didn't I understand me? So mine is just a little bit of a different story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but I will say,
feel like it's like,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I will say that as a child, I was extremely disorganized. If you had opened up my closet, my childhood bedroom closet, the diagnosis would have been right there.
Well, and boy. I think why that question is so important to me and why I always ask it is because it feels like, there's so much of that pushback around the fact that this is a fad, or, so much of the doubt for us in adulthood of, am I just making excuses? Am I really, is this actually ADHD, or is this something else? Like a lot of that internal doubt and confusion, I think it's helpful for us to look back and think like, no, this was a personality that I was born with, and this is how it manifested over certain periods of my life where it ebbed and flowed. And I, feels like a game of snakes and ladders a lot of the time, in terms of like feeling really great and feeling like I've got these answers and I've got these tactics and these strategies, and then falling back into old patterns, or, losing a sense of consistency and falling back. So it's like, yeah, I feel like it is so important for us in terms of our journey and our like understanding of how ADHD looks in our life, in terms of this diagnosis, and why I think so many of us don't think of this as a pathological diagnosis, right? It's really an incredible, it's a huge why. It's like a window opening for us, and it really allows us to kind of move forward and say, oh, now I know, now I can figure out the right strategies for me. And one of the reasons why The Queen of Distraction is so popular, and I think so wonderful of a book, is it answers so many of those now what questions, in such a helpful way, which is really, goes beyond the philosophy of ADHD or just the like take meds, but really practical. Like, I think of you, Terry, every time I move my hangers from one side to the other in my closet, in terms of when was the last time I wore this. Like those really, really practical answers that can be so life-changing for so many of us who have struggled.
Well, thank you for that. And the whole idea with the book was to reach out to explain to women who feel broken and lost that you don't need to feel that way. That, especially with therapy, and I'm a big proponent of therapy and coaching and medication if it's warranted, that there are answers, but we have to start from within ourselves. So I played out this scenario of two friends. One is hyperactive, one is inattentive, and it plays out very differently in the book and in real life. But we don't have to, just keep berating ourselves and saying, I just don't know where to begin. And it doesn't solve. Books, therapy, coaching doesn't solve how our brain works. It works with our brain. And so we're going to have these ups and downs. So here I am now, way into this whole thing, not just in a personal way, but in a professional way. I still falter, my house is still cluttered, but I have gotten to the point where I don't identify as being ADHD. I have an ADHD brain. That's the difference, I think, is that I've gotten to the point in my old age that I don't identify that way anymore. I am a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a partner, a wife, I've got, all the kids, I'm an artist, I'm a clinician, I'm a musician, all that. Focusing on the things that we do well and using some of these things like you just described will help, but it doesn't eliminate the problem. And that's where we have to really put some work into acceptance, self-acceptance, and going with our ADHD instead of pushing it away and identifying as something's wrong with me, something's wrong with me. Everybody has something going on. And I hear a lot about women who say, well, my husband or my partner, or whoever, they don't get me. And I remind them, they have something too that they're dealing with. Everybody does.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I think that's something we talk about a lot on this podcast, in terms of a lot of ADHD traits are looked at as character flaws, but especially for women, so much of this comes down to how we were socialized. And so what is, why are we holding shame around some of these behaviors like clutter or not wanting to do chores, right? And really questioning, like, well, why would you want to do chores? They're chores.
Well,
like, of course. Right?
Well,
of course they're
that's
boring.
the thing, when you have ADHD, one of the worst things that can happen is to be bored. So, and those are born things,
But one of the things, okay, so, two questions. First of all, you had mentioned about not feeling often like ADHD defines you. And so, one of the questions I have a lot of still, a much more earlier in my diagnosis, but I still don't really have answers for it, which is like, when you talk about ADHD, do you think about a neurodivergent brain that we are born with, and that is the ADHD? And then there are times where we really might struggle in certain environments, like school or boring jobs or that kind of thing, where our symptoms become worse. And there's times where we might really, really thrive with an ADHD brain in those moments. But it's the brain that we're talking about. Or when you talk about ADHD, do you feel like ADHD is the traits that are exhibited in as negative, so that if you're not struggling, your ADHD is like less or less severe.
So I think what you're saying is it a medical model versus a trait? Is that what I'm hearing is the question?
Yeah, or
Yeah.
almost yeah, like an identity.
So there's two, at least two schools of thought. There is you're born with an ADHD brain and it's a biochemical, developmental, whatever uh, way we were born. And other clinicians and researchers and writers will say, no, it's a trait. Others take it to the extent of saying it's a gift. I'm not in that category. I don't think it's a gift. Um, I think it's a combination. I think that we're born with a predisposition for having ADHD. And I think for some people, it comes out quickly and in a big raging way. In other people, it might be, we have just like anything else. You can have mild depression, severe depression, chronic depression. I think with ADHD, so we have the predisposition. It either comes out or it doesn't, generally comes out in some way. Depending on how you're raised, if you're raised with parents who are very structured and help you and are very involved, then maybe your ADHD won't be so devastating. As a trait, I would see it more like that. If you've had the right kind of upbringing, the right kind of help, and maybe you have a milder form of ADHD that you were born with, and you've learned strategies, and your life is the type of life that helps you with your ADHD. So some kinds of occupations, some kinds of situations you have in your family aren't very ADD friendly. So I think it can go either way. I look at myself as someone who was born with an ADHD brain. It's rampant in my family. I'm also very, very interested in the connection between trauma and ADHD. I think a lot of people with early trauma look like they have ADHD or they have both ADHD and trauma. I'm very interested in the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. It's pretty controversial in the ADD world. He happens to be a friend of mine, and I've been following his work for many, 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 many years. And he has some interesting things to say about how does ADHD show itself. So I think I've got one foot in each of these options that you're presenting.
That's a very therapist answer. It depends, right?
How do you feel about it? Tell me your
I
thoughts.
honestly, I love that Gabor Mate is willing to touch this subject, because I feel like there is so, I find it somehow very comforting and validating that the clinical world is so undecided about ADHD, because I feel like I am so endlessly confused by it. And so it feels, I love the fact that anyone is willing to pull up their boots and wade into the muck is okay with me, because it's that curiosity, right? It's the puzzle solving nature in us to want to really figure out what this is.
And I would worry about people who say it's only this or it's only this. So someone who says it's only trauma or it's only you're born with it's a genetic thing, and if your parent had it, you have a 60% chance of having ADHD yourself. So I think that there's room to waddle and take in. And maybe the most important thing is, well, how does it work for you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or exactly, what works for you. And I think a lot of the treatment for ADHD is successful treatment for anyone, right, with executive dysfunction. So as long as it's helping and it's working, then that's where this diagnosis can be so helpful. Which brings me to, I guess, my question that I love to ask pioneers in the field, which is, having seen this rise, this relatively huge influx of diagnoses in the last few years of adult women, especially. What do you make of it? Do you feel like it's a course correction, or do you feel like it is a fad, or do you feel like there's possibility for misdiagnoses? There was that, I don't know if you saw that article recently in the Psychiatric Times, but it just feels like every couple months there's some eye-rolling article that comes out about how, oh, everybody thinks this is ADHD and it's not, but there's not a lot of answers as to what it could be instead. So I'm curious, having seen the rise of TikTok and diagnoses. What are your
That's a
thoughts on
great
this?
question, Katie. That's a really good question. So I think there's a lot of parts to it. First of all, we had COVID. COVID changed the lives of men and women, kids, everybody. And I think, so I don't know if you want me to focus more on women or adults. So give me some guidance
I
on
mean,
that, and then I'll.
there's been a huge rise in both, I think,
Yeah.
right? Just in adult diagnoses in general. Yeah.
Right. So if you have this predisposition of having ADHD and you didn't know you had it and you weren't diagnosed and treated, but you've had your own challenges, now your whole life has changed. People with ADHD often don't do well with change. We don't transition too easily. When we learn about how to help our kids, we need to remind ourselves that it helps us as well. So you warn your child, hey, in about 5 minutes, we're going to have to stop playing the video game and get into homework time. We have to do the same thing with ourselves. With COVID and so many people working from home, losing that structure for a lot of people who don't have ADHD was difficult. But you throw in ADHD and you no longer have external forces keeping you on target. Your report is due at 1:15. We're going to have a meeting at 3, all those things. So now we're left to our own devices. So I think COVID had a huge emphasis on getting people thrown off so badly that they did reach out for help and found out they have ADHD. So there's COVID. And the world is changing so quickly. It seems like every couple of months there's another horrible thing happening in the world. And again, people with ADHD, this is something that Gabor Mate talks about, and I totally agree with. He believes that people who have ADHD are born with a sensitive nature. And that's kind of what I see. We hear about Dr. Dodson and his rejection, I always get this wrong, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And that's seen in people who are sensitive. That's what it is. It's being sensitive. So if you have a sensitive nature, and most of the people I know with ADHD, and I do myself, am particularly sensitive, these changes, whether they're large, like what's happening now in our world, or minor or something in between, it's going to hit us more deeply, more strongly than someone who may be able to just brush it off a little bit easier. So then we have these reactions. We have these reactions that might be like more severe, and like, why is it that it's bothering me? And then things start to come together, and we find out that we have ADHD. So it's a there's just the TikTok thing. I'll tell you something. I've heard I heard that there's a lot of misinformation about TikTok, and I got curious because if you have ADHD, you're curious. That's a given. So I jumped onto TikTok and I saw exactly what they were talking about. These 18, 19, 20-year-olds. I have ADHD because I didn't put my shoes away, whatever. So I opened up an account and I have a TikTok account where I'm trying to dispel myths, misinformation, because, like you said, so many people are now coming forward with, I think I have ADHD. Yes, I have ADHD. Well, just because your shoes aren't put away or you're late making dinner a couple nights a week does not mean you have ADHD. You have to go, as you know, through a very intensive workup with a knowledgeable clinician before you can be identified or diagnosed with having ADHD, not by a TikTok account. So there's that. And people have more time to be on TikTok. But I am worried. I'm worried about the influx of people being diagnosed and treated because I'm not sure. I am not sure. I think that there's a lot of answers. Another one is there's a lot. We have stats to show. I think Russ Barkley did it, maybe. I don't know who, of how many people are not identified. Way more are not identified than are identified. And I think what you're referring to, that study, if it's the same one I read, that now they think more adults have ADHD, the percentage just went up to over 3% of the population. I personally think there's more. I think we're still at that level where people are not being identified and treated. And these kinds of external things that are happening can bring them out, and they're going, for help. But according to, I believe it is Russ Barkley, the great majority of people are not being identified. That's a big problem. One of the things my work has been is to try and educate clinicians. Like when you hear someone come in, especially a woman, I'm depressed. I can't get it together. Well, they get antidepressants. You probably heard this story many times from your
That was
guests.
my life.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, you're depressed. Well, let's put you on antidepressants. Bye-bye. See you in 3 months for your next med checkup. Woman especially, comes back. I'm still depressed, doctor. All right, well, let's up your dosage. Well, maybe add a second kind of antidepressant. Or maybe you have anxiety. Well, let's add that. Come back. I'm still depressed, doctor. So we've made some impact on clinicians to better understand it, but we're still so far away from teaching them what to look for. I believe everybody who walks into a clinician's office should be screened for ADHD. Now, it's just been passed recently in the US, I believe, that now they're being screened for depression. Well, if it's depressed, you need to look for underlying ADHD. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
So I can't retire.
Katie,
I can't retire.
Well, one of the things, William Dodson at the last ADHD conference last year had talked about depression and anxiety as pre-diagnoses, and he felt like almost all of the ADHD clients he had seen over the years who had a how do I word this? I'm getting jumbled. Basically, I think he was saying if you have been depressed, if you have been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, it's almost a guaranteed precursor for ADHD. Those combinations of depression and anxiety diagnosis, he says, if that's been your experience, look into ADHD because there's such a correlation between those two. And I often feel like I would add to that if your clients are asking questions like, what's wrong with me? That's a huge flag. That confusion, right? That confusion and the frustration and that inability to move forward that exists prior to an ADHD diagnosis, not just the despondency of depression, but the real that frustration element that I certainly always had with like you said, with the depression, where I was like, well, if I'm this depressed on medication, how bad am I going to be off of it, right? Or maybe we need to up the dose, but always feeling like those diagnoses never fit.
And here's what makes it more confusing for the clinician is that people who are significantly depressed can't do daily things. They have a hard time getting out of bed. They have a hard time taking care of kids, taking care of work issues, home things at home. It can become very complicated. So the other piece to this would be what we talked about a minute ago. If you're not getting better on antidepressants, that's another huge red flag. And this is what I hear so many times. And this, what's wrong with me? There's a book called, I forgot who wrote it, maybe you know, and it's titled something like, he says in the book, it's not what's wrong with me, it's what happened to me. And that's where you get what Gabor might talk about and some other people who are involved in trauma. That's another clue, what happened to me? And I don't hear that from people who are depressed so much as we can't do daily activities. We can't do things that other people seem to be able to do. That is a really good point. Like, what's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And also just questioning. I think why trauma is such an important question to have with around ADHD is, how do we even begin to determine how much trauma a life undiagnosed has given us, right? In terms of how we've been treated by teachers or how we would, the negative comments of children and all of that. How do we even begin to quantify how much trauma we maybe experienced by having a neurodivergent brain and being undiagnosed?
Exactly. We think, too many people think that trauma means you got shot or you were raped or some horrible, horrible, horrible things. But trauma can also mean you weren't heard. Growing up as a child, your parents didn't understand you. Your needs weren't met because they didn't listen to you. They didn't understand you because you did have this difference in your brain differences and abilities at the time. And that is a trauma. People don't think of those things as being trauma, but if you have a lack of attachment and bonding with your mother, for instance, or a parent, that's traumatizing because now you don't have the tools you need to grow up and feel secure and capable and you just, you're thrown. This is especially if you have a predisposition. I'm saying this throws you over the cart. That now you're really floundering, and then your self-esteem goes down to zero. All these things are combined. Just think about it. If all of this is on your mind, or even at an unconscious level, how are you going to have the energy and the ability to file your papers or look for your tax papers to get that done in time? We're just laden with all of these layers of difficulties and challenges which start early on. I think that's a big problem we're not looking at enough, is how were you raised? How did people understand you? What were your parents like when you didn't do well in school? Were they rallying for you? Did they help you? Did they set up strategies to help you with your work, your homework, and all that? Were they talking to your teachers? Well, in my day, no, that didn't happen. In today's day, we're more informed, but still now with what we were talking about earlier with COVID, with change, with jobs and moving, and it's hard to put that attention that's needed into your children's, not only their education, but their daily lives. It's hard on a parent, especially if that parent has ADHD. So think of all the layers we're talking about, especially if you have a parent with ADHD. It's hard. Moms with ADD, they have my heart. Moms with ADD have my heart. Oops.
I know. I've often said I want to go back to the version of me. I want to go back to me when I had babies and just give that version of me a hug, knowing what I know now, because I feel like so many women really struggle in that period of time, and I had no idea why, right? And so I often thought, what's wrong with me?
I did too. So that part is very important for moms listening to this, is that give yourself a hug. You didn't know, or even if you did know, just if you take one little piece, and that would be sleep deprivation. In those early months when I had kids, I was out of my mind, because a lot of women with ADHD need that rest, because we work so hard all day long into the night to keep it together. Not only keeping our house together, but giving what our family needs, the children, our partner. We think of ourselves last, and that's a big problem. And so these moms with ADHD really struggle with terrible self-esteem. We lose it easily because we might be a little bit more emotional, and we don't have the brakes on our emotions and our behaviors at times. But we slap each other. I'm not slapping, we slap ourselves for what you're describing. And I can just see it on your face that you had a rough go. I did too. And I hope the moms listening, you give yourselves some slack. It is so hard when you have ADHD, and even if your children don't have ADHD, they're needy, they're loud. Oh my gosh, I had a terrible time with that. I'm an inattentive woman with inattentive ADHD. My kids were the exact opposite. It was a terrible mismatch in terms of temperament. So I had to deal with a lot of shrieking and noise and music and dancing and jumping and tapping and rah, rah, rah. That just about did me in.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved that part in The Queen of Distraction. I really appreciated when you talked about the importance of taking time for yourself, because I remember, especially when my kids were little, they're teenagers now, and so I often don't see them sometimes all day, but I remember like when Mother's Day would come around, and every year all I wanted for Mother's Day was for everybody to leave me alone, right? And I just always used to be like, what a terrible mother that's all I want for Mother's Day is for everybody to get the hell out of the house. And I used to feel bad about it. So I really appreciated the fact that you addressed how important it is for that quiet and that time to recharge, and reframing it in terms of like how that makes us a better parent. And I just, it felt very validating to have that permission.
I think that we need to learn to express what our needs are. We were raised, you mentioned it in the beginning of this podcast, that we take on society's expectations. When I'm talking about women and girls, from the time we're young girls, we're taught, even in very not verbal ways, we take care of others. We do, it's in the book, we do a million things to keep everyone together. We make the doctor's appointments, check with the teachers, make sure their clothes are clean. It's gotten better where men do more things than they did, years ago, but we're not there yet. So we do so much for the family and for other people in general that we let our own needs go unspoken. And then what happens is just what you described, I need downtime. I'm the same way, especially if you're an inattentive mom and you've got young children who tend to be boisterous and loud and a lot of commotion. It just took everything out of me. And I had these same exact feelings that you're describing. What kind of mother? I remember one of my daughters on Mother's Day wanted to give me breakfast in bed. Now, I'm not a morning person, as many women with ADHD are like that. We're night owls. I come alive at 9 p.m. So at 7:30 in the morning, my daughter comes in with a tray of something that she made was adorable, but it's not what I needed. It's not what I needed. It's what she needed. It's what she needed to do. So though I was very gracious, and I have no appetite when I wake up, I put the tray aside and I thanked her and all blah, blah, blah. But yeah, we need to explain our needs instead of always being in the background, giving, giving, giving. They come first. They come first. Well, yeah, as parents, we do need to take care of our children, but we have needs as well.
Well said. I want to get back a bit to the topic of grief because I know this is a really difficult time right now, and we've had it, like you said, it feels like since 2020 we've just been bombarded in a way, in an unprecedented way, by it just feels like every time you turn around, there's some other catastrophic news event that is really difficult for us to process. And I have a lot of thoughts about hypersensitivity and emotional sensitivity and current events and the news, right? And I feel like I'm turning this into a free therapy session, so stop me if you're like, I don't want to do that. But so one of my coping strategies has been to just get off of social media. I feel like social media is a really dangerous place for shouting into the void. It's not nuanced. I prefer having one-on-one intentional conversations. I find it affects my mental health tremendously to be in the conversation, right? Being in the arena, so to speak, of these really, really complicated issues. And so I have often just retreated. And I saw a TikTok recently that I can't stop thinking about, which was, when you retreat from social media, when you retreat from the conversation, that's basically white supremacy. You have the privilege to retreat. And so I'm really holding both of these realities because I do see that there is a privilege there in terms of retreating from social media, but I also feel like I cannot engage. And I feel like there are a lot of neurodivergents out there who really struggle with, the weightiness of grief in these topics, and how best to process this grief, how best to engage in meaningful ways. I'm curious how you've been dealing with this, and how ADHD comes into play with all of this.
Well, in terms of the ADHD, so I hear what you're saying, and I am completely blown into the current Middle East whatever word I'm thinking of, conflicts. Mm-hmm. And, with an ADHD brain, we are sensory seeking. Our brain is, not always our body, because we also can be overwhelmed quite easily, but our brains are looking for stimuli. And it becomes a conflict right there. My brain is saying, I need to know, I need to know, I need to know. My body is saying, this is exhausting me. I'm getting upset. I'm getting overreactive. All these things are bothering. So it's a push-pull for me. The thing that you said about white supremacy is very interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that we have options. We have options in a lot of ways mentally. We can decide just turn off social media, just walk away, say, it's nowhere near me. What do I care? There's a lot of people who just don't care because it's not in our backyard. But my brain is saying, what's going on here? And part of that for me, I don't know about you, is anxiety. What's this hypersensitivity that people with ADHD have. What's going to happen now? I need to know. How will I know? Well, I got to turn on the news, or I got to turn on social media. So you're doing the right thing. We need to listen to ourselves, our brains and our bodies. So if our brains are seeking out stimuli because we can't be bored, maybe think about where can I put this energy? Where can I put this energy where I'm still involved maybe in understanding what's going on in the world, whether it's climate issues, which is a big thing too, or earthquakes, far, far away from where we are. There's a lot going on. Where can I put that energy where it's not going to make me upset, depressed, anxious, overstimulated? Where can I shift that out? If turning off social media or not going on social media is what works for you, do that. And maybe take little tiny sound bites if you really want to stay on top of things. Instead of watching things on TV, read the newspaper. Um, if you don't want to get tangled up in these arguments that you see on social media, which are very disturbing to me, do what you're doing. Get off of it. But I do think that a lot of it, again, has to do with our sensitivity issues, that we take it in so deeply that it affects us. And I think just recognizing that might be the first step in knowing what to do about it. No, I'm hypersensitive. This really, it gives me a reaction that's not healthy for me, but I still want to stay involved. You could ask somebody who is really involved. Just give me a 2-liner. Where are we with this thing that happened and this thing that happened? And then you have enough. Just get enough of what you need, and then take the focus into something that's healthier for you without the guilt. I don't know if
Yeah.
that
Oh
answers your
gosh.
question, but I'm kind of...
Well, the without the guilt part, I was like, I don't know if that's gonna happen, but but I like the way you phrase where you said, where can I put my energy, right? So it's acknowledging that the energy is still there and it needs a place to go, right? Energy needs a place to go. But where is the most helpful place for me to put my energy right now? Isn't retreating. It's being prudent. It's being thoughtful and not shouting into the void.
Well, there's other things. So if you have an idea of where you stand on let's talk about climate control right now. You have very strong feelings about making this a better world for us and our children, grandchildren, and on generation. Well, you could do, volunteer work. You can donate money to the cause, whatever it is, without jumping into, I'm putting on my gloves and I'm going to, clean up the streets every Friday at 3, whatever. What works for you? What works for your brain? And again, it comes into self-understanding, and that can come from therapy again, or being with people who understand you and you have, similar ideas about things. Ask your friends, how are you managing during these crises? What do you do? But yeah, I think we need to shift the focus if it's too painful, too damaging to ourselves. And if that happens, then, it creates a ripple that affects our families. And finding another positive way to deal with that, to work with it, that may, as you said, may do something to help the issue without jumping in and being disturbed by it.
Yeah. It's funny. I talking about hypersensitivity in general, or just sensitivity, is a fascinating topic to me too. So I want to pick your brain about this because I know you talk a lot about sensitivity in your book, and I had posted a couple of years ago. I posted some videos that were like surprising things about ADHD that I didn't know about, and I talked a lot about sensitivity to fabric, sensitivity to overhead lighting. I talked about preference for one mug above all others, or
Yeah.
how important the size of my spoon is. And oftentimes I would get that comment back, which is, well, no, you're talking about autism. That's not ADHD. And so I found that interesting because I was like, well, there's a lot of overlap in terms of ADHD and autism when it comes to sensory stuff. But now I'm like, well, are we talking about autism when it comes to the sensory stuff? Because now there's, this dual diagnosis of ADHD, and I'm like, now I don't know where one ends and the other begins. How do I define what is ADHD and what is autism and what is both? Why is it so important for me to define this is another question that I don't know. But I'm curious, how does that land? How are you able to kind of distinguish between the two, and when it comes to sensory and sensitivity?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on autism, so I have to be careful because a lot of people watching this are experts or they have both. I don't. I have just the ADHD. But there is an overlap with hypersensitivities. I do know that. And it can be confusing, but I think that if you're really evaluating this or you're just questioning, do I have both? there are differences. I don't want to get into them only because I don't know enough about autism and I don't know enough about differential diagnoses. But I kind of have a sense when people talk to me about certain problems that they're having and they're wondering, could it be more than ADHD? And I kind of listen and then suggest that they get evaluated by someone who does know the subtle differences. But with people with ADHD, I can get into the hypersensitivities, which are very common, but most people are unaware of them. And that's why I wrote that chapter. And I do a lot of talking about hypersensitivities because it's so painful to live in this world. And some of the things you described are exactly how I feel. Like when I'm home and I don't have to be around people, I wear clothes a size too big. I don't like feeling restricted, constricted. I hate it. Now here's something interesting. I think for years, I've been trying to find an OT, an occupational therapist, who evaluates adults with sensory issues. Sensory processing disorder is an actual thing. It's an actual diagnosis, and I think I have it, but I could not in all these years, couldn't find someone until about 6 months ago. And she happens to be local to me. I'm in the Detroit area. If anyone's curious, contact me. I'll give you her name. And I went through an evaluation. She said, "Oh my God, yeah, everything bothers me. It's not just one thing. For some people, it's just a couple of things that bother them, like bright lights or textures of food, textures of clothing, certain kinds of sounds." Well, I have almost across the board something in every category. I think there's 5 categories, some that we already know, like visual, auditory, taste, and texture. I can't remember the exact words. I have in every single category. So she gave, and it was almost like the ADHD diagnosis. It wasn't, oh, gee, I wish my mother knew when I was 8 years old why I wouldn't wear a certain kind of outfit, or I wouldn't wear pants with a funny waistband that little girls wore back then, or I wouldn't wear wool, blah, blah. I didn't go there. It's like, okay, it's confirmed. What I thought was going on with me all these years finally been confirmed. I think I also have auditory processing disorder because and this is very common in ADHD, any little sound in the room when we're talking one-on-one, I can't focus. My attention is completely gone, and it's as if I have lost my hearing because I have to keep saying, huh, what did you say? I'm sorry, what did you say? So I'm still looking for solutions for how to manage that. I hate talking on the phone. And you ask a lot of people with ADHD, do you like talking on the phone? And I would say the majority hates talking on the phone. And I think part of it is, first of all, it's all auditory. And we need more, at least people I work with and myself, we need more of our senses to take in information. On the other hand, if we take in too much information, we get overwhelmed. So do you see? It's like a no-win. And that's why it's so important to learn more about ourselves. Now, you're talking about your hypersensitivities, and I'm so glad to hear that. Because most people, when I talk about it, say, huh? You mean it's not that I'm just weird? And then you feel like there's a heaviness because you ask, or you're afraid to ask people, can you please turn off the TV while I'm reading? So a lot of people can automatically filter out that kind of stuff. I cannot. And it's frustrating, and it makes me anxious, and it makes me angry and irritable. So, I could go on and on that topic.
I know, right? I reminded of how many times I sat down to take an exam in university in like a giant gymnasium, and I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, and I just knew. I was like, oh well, I'm not going to do well. Like it just completely took over. And it's fascinating because I've talked to some guests where we talk about this idea of like occupying a section of your brain with, say, white noise or music or something. It's like you need to introduce a stimulation for one part of your brain so that the other part of your brain can work better, right? So it's like if I read, I need ocean sounds because otherwise I'll just read the same page over and over and over again. And I'm like, there's something about that, right? Where it's like there's this distractible part of your brain that needs to be occupied so that the focus part of your brain can work properly.
Now that's a first for me. That's interesting because I have the opposite problem. Any little kind of sound, even if it's white noise or ocean noise, sounds that I really like, I can't take both in. I cannot take both in. So I have to have complete silence, which was hard in college. because my younger brother was a musician. He was, younger, but he was playing the drums. He had a band and they were in the basement. I had to go outside in the backyard to study and do my homework. I mean, even if he had played gentle little piano music, I wouldn't be able to focus. Of course, back then I didn't know
Oh
about
yeah.
ADD. No. So unlike you, but that's really, really interesting. It makes sense because I know some people, I don't know if they have ADHD or not, they have to have the TV on while they're working. They have to have that background noise. I can't do
Yeah.
that, but they do.
Well, it's funny because I definitely could not have a TV on because that would distract me. But I study in a coffee shop. I go to Starbucks to study now,
Whoa.
and so it's like, and I did that first time around in university. I always did all of my best studying in a coffee shop, and so I'm like, so I have to have some kind of background noise.
That is so interesting. I
So
have not heard
yeah,
that. I have not heard that. But getting back to the
yeah,
sensory thing in autism, just because we might have a lot of sensory sensitivities does not automatically mean you have autism. But if you have other issues, and I don't want to get into them because I don't want to give the wrong information out, um, go to a mental health professional and get evaluated. Just make sure, and this is what I say to people who are going for an ADD evaluation, make sure they are experts in the field, not a generalist. Because wow, there's so many people have gone to just a regular, clinician. Do I have ADHD? Well, you did so well in school. You got a college degree. How can you have ADHD? And then, boom, you're depressed. I'm laughing, but it's not a laughable thing. Yeah, so go to someone
that's
who.
another one I think we tend to do. We tend to. It's like a coping mechanism. I feel like every time I talk about my trauma, I laugh along with it.
Well, that's a good, interesting topic right there too. It could be discomfort. It could be a way to push it away. Some denial and embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of reasons for that, but it's pretty common. You're not alone.
Okay, I have two more questions for you before I let you go. If you have time, I know it's we've. I don't want to keep you if you have somewhere to go, but I have so many questions for you,
No, this
Terry.
is go for it. I just have to
So
be in
much.
another
Okay, good.
session at 3. So anytime before 3, I'm good.
Okay.
Go
All
for it.
right, perfect. So now you had released a blog post recently about your pet peeves around ADHD, which I found very entertaining and shared all of them. One of the ones that I'm more agnostic about was the person first versus identity first language around ADHD. Now you had mentioned it's your pet peeve when people use identity first, when people refer to themselves as an ADHDer, and so I'm curious. Is what bothers you about the identity first?
Yeah, I'm laughing. I put that on social
It
media,
was
and
controversial, right? I was gonna say you got a lot of feedback on that one.
I got a lot of feedback, and I understand where they're coming from. I think part of it is generational, that the younger generation identifies as an ADHDer or a queer or whatever it is in whatever arena that they're in. For me, I don't like, to me, it sounds like you belong to an exclusive club. I'm an ADHDer. So people with depression don't walk around saying, I'm a depressioner. I put this in the article. People with anxiety don't say, well, I'm an anxieter. I think I even said with OCD. I don't know that I've heard people say, well, I'm an OCDer. Or someone with Tourette's syndrome, do they say I'm a ticker? So it just doesn't feel right to me. I'm a person who happens to have an ADHD brain. I don't identify as an ADD or an ADHD, or that is secondary, or even third, whatever. I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, and all those things. I'm not an ADHDer. Why that bothers
Mm.
me, I'm not sure. Except from what I'm just explaining. That's not when I walk into a party or a group of people. I don't say, "Hi, my name is Terry. I'm an ADHDer." It just doesn't sit right with me. I'm Terry. I'm this. I do that and that. And if comes up about, well, I have depression, I have anxiety, I have ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think
Yeah,
that quite
yeah.
answered your
It's
question. There's something bothering you.
Well, no,
Tell
I
me.
mean, I am curious. I think I can see both sides, absolutely. And I think that, it's curious to me because I think there is a way in which so much of this diagnosis in adulthood is about reframing, right? And I am the last person who will call ADHD a superpower. But I think there are ways in which a lot of our treatment plan, so to speak, is self-acceptance and reframing what ADHD looks like, and that that there is a lot of positives to this. So I understand why people want to embrace the identity of ADHD and not look at it as a disorder or a disability. But at the same time, there is a lot of struggle. It's not an inherently positive element to my personality. And so do I want to be thought of only as a person with ADHD? No, of course not. There's so many more aspects to my life. I just don't, it just doesn't bother me, I guess, for somebody to use it because it's easier, right? Yeah.
That's a good thing.
But I love to think about it.
It could be a generational thing. I don't know. Maybe this is how people talk more about having ADHD than they did, 25, 30 years ago when I was, whatever. I don't know. I don't know why it bothers me, except that it feels like we're an exclusive club. And it's almost like, well, this is a problem and I'm going to own up to it, but take it maybe a little too much. I don't know if I can even explain it right. Because there were a few people that did agree in social media, and they explained it way better than I could.
I mean, I think there is I think there are a lot of ways in which person first is an important way, like you said, or even like, you wouldn't call a person with cancer a cancerous person. So there are ways in which, it's not our entire identity, but at the same time, I'm like, well, is separating yourself from the ADHD, which essentially you're doing with person first language, is that somehow indicating that there's a way that you might be able to cure it, or that there's a version of you without it? And something about identity first, especially in the autistic community, is that there's no way of separating myself from the ADHD. So there's no version of me that exists without it. And so therefore it's identity first. But I don't know. Like I said, I see both sides, and I always love thinking about it.
Well, it's something for me to think more about. I know that the Asperger's community, we don't even use the term Asperger's anymore. Unfortunately, I have a real issue with that, if you want to talk about. That's so unfortunate that there's one term for all of autism. I don't go for that. But, a lot of people identify as I'm an Aspie. Now, I don't have Asperger's, I don't have autism, but it's the same kind of thing. And I need to, you've given me some food for thought. And if people respond to what we're talking about, I like to learn from other people. I don't want to offend people, but it'll help me be a better person to understand, well, what is it about saying I'm an ADDer that makes you feel better about it? I'd like to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Which leads me to my favorite question I love to ask at the end of my interviews is if you could come up with a name, do you have an issue with the name ADHD? And if you could rename it to something else, what
I do have an issue because it's not a deficit of attention at all. It's where we put our attention. It's having control. I haven't thought up of a term that really is right for me, but it has to do with being able to have power over control. But I did have to look at my notes because I came up with a couple of, this doesn't show up on the screen, does it? No, because I would never be able to memorize it. But I had some, light-hearted terms like more than able, less label. That's not really a clinical term, but I'm just being lighthearted. Where are my keys condition? Can't turn off your brain trait. But then I came up with something that did seem possible, and that was executive function variable intention condition. That's a mouthful. That's not going to work. But I think the basis of our problems is executive function. And I'm sure that from all of your podcasts, it's been explained what executive function is. I don't want to take up space with that, but it's variable and we don't always have control. And I think that's a big thing. And all the stuff about self-regulation is a big part of it too. self-regulation and variability of being able to control our attention. But then there's so much more to it, as we've been talking about. There's the sensory stuff.
Right.
There's self-esteem stuff. It's the what's wrong with me stuff. There's so much to this. I don't know how you would just get 4 words, but no, I don't like ADHD as a diagnostic label. I hate it. Attention deficit. I could be on the computer for 5 hours straight. Where's my attention? It's just in the wrong place. So
Yeah, absolutely. And same with hyperactivity was one of those things that I recognize it in many ways now in terms of my internalized hyperactivity and my internalized thinking, but it was certainly not anything that I related to. And in fact, I would say it put me off looking into ADHD because I'd never thought of myself as a hyperactive person. And one of the things I like, Dodson refers to, he prefers hyperarousal instead of hyperactivity. And that's one of the ones I really like
I agree
because
with that
I
one.
definitely could relate to hyperarousal.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I had never heard of the term executive functioning until I was diagnosed and started looking into it. And that's where I'm like, why don't they teach that in school? Why are they teaching home ec?
Yeah, get rid of the, oh God, I flunked sewing class big time. But we weren't talking about executive functioning in the beginning. There wasn't much talk about it. So it's not that it's new that we're focusing on it, but it's newer. So, there was a lot of talk
Hmm.
about hyperactivity and inattention and that sort of thing. And I'm so glad to see that it's now being talked to EF, executive functioning. And
Hmm.
that's really, it's all about getting from A to B and from B to C. And in that A to B, B to C are all these different parts, the planning, you know, all those things fall under, I mean, ADHD falls under that in a big, big way. And I'm glad that we're talking about it in that way now. But I like what Dotson says. I didn't
Yeah.
read that one. I didn't see that, but I like that.
Right? Yeah, that's how I kind of like to think about it now. Although I really like the what's wrong with me syndrome.
Yeah, that
Nothing's
was
wrong with you,
real.
right? That's what Sari
Yeah.
Solder would say. Nothing's wrong with you.
Oh
Well,
yeah, she says the only thing that needs fixing is furniture and your pet, dogs,
dogs. Yeah.
and your furniture. I thought, oh my God, that's brilliant. We're not
Although I will say,
broken. Go ahead.
one of the things that I laughed about, I used that quote when for her interview or for her episode, and I didn't realize that fixing your animal is a uniquely North American phrase. So all of these UK women in the UK and Australia were coming at me about dogs, and they were like, "My dog is wonderful. My dog does not need to be changed." I was like, "No, it's actually it just means
That's
you're snipping them." But yeah.
hilarious. So what term do they use?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know what they use
I'd like to.
for neutering, but yeah. Anyway, well, Terry, thank you so much. This has been so wonderful. Really, really a treat to get to pick your brain and yeah, to thank you so much for all that you put into this world and your incredible books and the incredible education for all of us. So thank you
Oh,
so much.
thank you, Katie. You had great questions and it was a lot of fun. So thanks, and hopefully I can come back again sometime.
Oh, I'd love that. Awesome.